introduce our speaker today, Elizabeth Frisbee. I have to be honest, I became a fan of Elizabeth when she spoke at our conference, our Family Leaders Conference in April. She was so well received and gave such amazing practical advice that was easy to use in the moment. And families that were at that conference really had amazing things to say about her. And we had the opportunity to have her come back here in the summer. So we were thrilled that she had the space in her schedule to do so. Elizabeth has worked with children, their families, and educators for over 30 years as a psychotherapist, behavior specialist, mental health consultant, and family support specialist. She holds master's degrees in education and clinical and child and family psychology, earned the infant early childhood mental health credential, and is a certified parent educator. Committed to inclusion and making schools safe and successful spaces for all students, Elizabeth belongs to the statewide Early Childhood Least Restrictive Environment Stakeholders Consortium. As a member of the Illinois Association for Infant Mental Health, she serves on the leadership team for the Credential Project and facilitates reflective practice groups. Elizabeth is the proud parent of 2 daughters, one of whom has special needs. Her experiences navigating the school system alongside her daughter allow Elizabeth to bring both professional and personal perspectives to her workshops, and I think you'll see that today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, and we will come back for questions and answers toward the end.
All right. Well, thank you, Megan. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Elizabeth Frisbee, and I'm going to start sharing. Let's see. Megan, it looks like you need to give me permission to share.
Okay, let me do that real quick.
So while we're waiting for that, as Megan told you, I do most of my work with school districts providing support for children with challenging behaviors or those who have disabilities or other special needs who are kind of struggling to fit in a little bit. And that comes from both my training in education and psychology, but also being the parent of a daughter who has some special needs. So I'm going to start today by kind of sharing a little bit of our story, and then we'll talk more specifically about kind of what we can do as parenting adults as well as professionals in terms of supporting our children and those children with whom we might be working, because I know some of us have dual roles. So I want to make sure that everyone can see my slides. You have copies of the information and the exercises that we're going to be doing in that handout. And then I also provided a couple other pages and opportunities for you as well. And I'm going to make myself a note because I think we still need to send you the web page also. All right, so this presentation is entitled Calm and Connection Are Protection, because originally when Sherry and Megan talked with me about doing something for the conference focused on mental health, I was trying to think of some things that would be broad and work for everyone. And so the idea that kind of finding that calm center as an important skill for resiliency and our well-being and our mental health, that's a skill that, and a research-based strategy that applies to all human beings, regardless if you are neurotypical or neuroatypical, have a disability or not. So that's something that I wanted to share with everyone. And then the other thing that we know is really important for all of us humans is that we have a sense of connection in whatever way works for us. So we're going to be also talking about that in terms of kind of what can we do as parenting adults and professionals to create space in our homes and in our schools and other environments where children and adolescents have the maximum potential to feel that, you know, support and that they belong, and kind of those skill sets. So some of my interest comes just from my professional background. As a clinician, but a lot of my interest in kind of children's mental health comes from being the parent of my 2 daughters, whose pictures you should be able to see now. So if we were all together in a room, I would ask you to kind of raise your hands. So I'm just going to say, like, think to yourself, if I were to say to you, one of my daughters has kind of an easygoing, more happy-go-lucky personality, and the other one tends to be more reserved and has diagnosed with some fairly severe anxiety and kind of has that more fearful temperament. You could probably guess from looking at this picture and the expression on their faces kind of who is who. So my youngest daughter is the one who has had to overcome quite a bit of issues surrounding anxiety and sensory processing throughout her life. So one of the things that I like to do is share our story and kind of some of the mistakes we made and some of the things that we learned along the way together, in hopes that maybe part of our journey will be helpful to those of you who are just starting out or who might be kind of just right behind us. So I'd like to kind of share the lessons that Gwen and I learned along the way. All right. So as Megan mentioned, I am also trained as an educator. So I have teaching background as well. And so one of the things that was really important to me as Gwen was growing up was that we talked about her disability and the ways that it might impact her in terms of both her sensory things that were happening, as well as the anxiety that she was experiencing at various times. I think as both as a professional and as a parent, that can be really helpful to our kids, because some of them, depending on how aware they are of themselves, some of them may start wondering, hey, why am I different from other people? Or why do I have this experience? Or in Gwen's case, it was kind of like, why am I so hesitant to try new things? Or, I don't really like to play with other kids. Or if it gets too loud, like I want to go under the teacher's desk. So we learned very early on, her father and I, that it was really important to kind of share with her about what her various diagnoses were, and kind of how that was impacting her experience. Now, I will say, we always, as parenting adults, want to think about a couple things when we're talking with our kids about their disability or communicating in whatever way works best for them. So the first is kind of, how old are they in general, right? And kind of thinking about what at this age, what do kids typically understand, right? And in that context, when we're thinking age, we always want to think about not just chronological age, which is our child's age and a number, but also kind of their cognitive age. Some of us have kids whose cognitive functioning might be years or months delayed or different than their chronological age. Those of us that have kids that have had challenging experiences in their lives or some trauma, who may have, things like anxiety or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, we also want to think about the social age of our children, or the social emotional age of our children. Or some of you may have kids who have diagnoses that impact their social emotional development in some way. So when I think about age of both my own kids, but also the kids with whom I'm working, I like to think about that. So I do recognize kind of how old they are in years and months, but what's more important to me is kind of, where is their functional level? Cognitively, but also behaviorally or socially, emotionally. And so we always want to know our kids really well and adjust how we're communicating and the level of information we're sharing to make sure that it's understandable to them, right? And it makes sense to them, however that works best. We also know that when kids have been educated along the way, it encourages them to understand the challenges I'm facing have a reason. Like, it isn't just that, it's not that there's something wrong. It's that there's something different here. Or, oh gosh, I'm struggling with this. Nobody else seems to, when they hit that point, if they do, where they are interested in what peers think about them, it helps to kind of have a reason. The other thing we know is that as kids age and have kind of a better understanding of themselves, if that's part of their development, we know that that can help foster a recognition of what fits in their circle of control. So these are behaviors that I have control over. These are the things that I can manage or learn how to accommodate for or do something about. And here's some things that I might always be this way, and they're harder to manage, but that's okay too. So depending on what your child's diagnosis might be, you may have different things that fit in those boxes for them. But I did find over time with Gwen that that was a really important part of our experience together, is kind of talking through, well, what do I have control over? What things can I learn skills to help me manage better, either with support or by herself? Or what are some things that they might just keep happening, and maybe I might not really be able to manage them, but that's okay, right? And so kind of thinking about where those boxes might be for your kid. Other things that we learned along the way relate to how kids are relating to the disability that they have. All right. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this, with the caveat that this will also change as your child ages, right? In terms of if they have an innate sense of themselves as part of their development, you will see some of these things shift. So what I'm saying is, just because your kiddo believes one thing at age 6, they may have a different concept about it when they get to be 10, 16, 21, 34. So it's important as a parenting adult to kind of be mindful of, where is my child at with these things right now? Right. So one of the identity pieces is, how do they perceive how big their disability is, if you will. So is it a piece of their puzzle? So it goes with many things, or is it their main identity? And I can share with you, at different points in her life, Gwen has felt different ways about kind of how her anxiety fits in her life. She has had times where it's felt really big to her in terms of overwhelming. So it was kind of like, I am my anxiety. She's also had other times where she's like, I'm a person who has anxiety, who is also, a redhead, super creative, loves to read, loves to be with her cats, right? So it becomes more part of the puzzle. I've also seen her development as a writer and an advocate for herself and others, to where, rather than her anxiety feeling like it's my main part of my identity because it's so overwhelming, it is a big part of who I am, or my dominant part, because that's my identity in this moment, like in this moment of advocating for others, or in this moment of completing this application. So again, this is something that can shift over time for our kids, or even moment to moment, but it's worth kind of keeping an eye on how your child is relating to their disability, in terms of how big of an identity piece is it for them. The other thing to kind of keep an eye on too is, kids go through different phases, and sometimes if your child is relating to peers, this one tends to have a lot to do with kind of how peers are, how much they're important to them, and what their peer interactions look like. So you may run into times where your kid is kind of like, I don't see it, I don't hear it, I'm not talking about it, it doesn't exist as part of me. Like, I really just don't want this piece to have much of a part. So they'll try and ignore whatever their disability or delay or difference might be. Other times you'll have where your kids are acknowledging, like, yep, This is a part of who I am. So you might see them talk about it with their peer group or within the family or with their educators, or if you belong to a religious group of some sort, you may see them acknowledging it in if they enjoy things like writing or painting or art making in some way. So again, watch for that shift in terms of what do I want to do with it? Do I kind of avoid, ignore, or am I acknowledging it? And then if I'm acknowledging it, is it a piece of my puzzle, or is it kind of being viewed as either most of me or all of me? And those things can shift. I want to share that with Gwen, as she was growing up, I noticed most often as her mom that when she was really struggling with her peer group, kind of not understanding kind of why she was hesitant to join, or why she was kind of under her desk for part of kindergarten, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. It was when other kids were kind of picking on her about it, or kind of like, oh, you are really different, she would very often try and kind of push her anxiety away and ignore it, and really kind of try to push herself to be more similar. That didn't work really well for her. So what we noticed with Gwen is she very quickly kind of developed this very strong sense of, this is who I am, and you can like it or not. I really just don't care. Which for some children, they misperceived as her being hostile, kind of that standoffish protectiveness, or even where she was just observing to feel more comfortable. Other kids would kind of miscue on that. So we want to always be mindful of kind of how is our child interacting with their disability, with their peer group, in terms of, am I pretending like it's not there and not an issue, if you will, or am I acknowledging it and maybe trying to help others understand or accept that the adults in my life might try and help others to understand. And then the other thing in terms of this is, I think that kids over time have different emotional relationships with the various parts of themselves, including things like special needs, abilities, disabilities, and the things that are typically developing and atypically developing. They're going to go through phases where they really hate being different, right? And sometimes what that means is they're just going to, try and push it away. And it's almost like, I don't have this, right? I don't have to deal with it. I don't even have this. And what are you talking about? From a psychological perspective, if your kiddo hits one of those trying to disown it phases, the issue there is it has been a piece of them, developmentally. So it's almost like they're trying to kind of metaphorically cut that part of self away. And that could be really painful, both for us as parenting adults, but also for our children and our adolescents. So we want to kind of be mindful of, a lot of times when kids are pushing that away, it's because it's become painful to them. Like it's hurting and feeling ouchy to them to be different from other kids. So that's sometimes a time, if you see your child disowning, that's a time to step in as a loving grown-up and kind of help them see it as a piece of their puzzle. That seemed to work really well when Gwen went through those phases. So we would kind of shift from into kind of saying, it's a small piece, right? Gwen is very visual and very artistic and creative as a person. And at one point in her life, I went to Goodwill and got just an old puzzle where the pieces weren't all there. And we, flipped it on the back, and she wrote or drew about each piece of herself, and we kind of reassembled it. And I've also done that activity with children and adolescents as a psychotherapist as well. So if that's something cognitively that would work for your child, if you hit that disown piece, or you're trying to help them expand their self-confidence and their self-concept, that can be a really nice activity to do to help them think of, it's a part of their puzzle, because we want to also make sure that we at some point have an opportunity to kind of do that next phase of more of a neutral, it's just part of who I am. Right. So when you see your kiddos going through phases where they're able to kind of say, if they have that internal sense of recognition, this is just me being me, that lets you know that they're in the phase where it's kind of just a piece of their puzzle. So I'm acknowledging it, but I'm also recognizing that it's a part of what makes me me. Right. So a lot of times when we see that neutral space happening, it's a good sign developmentally. And a lot of kids too are going to go through a situation where they are honoring or celebrating, if you will, whatever it is that makes them different. And that might, if your child hasn't done that yet, that might sound really, really weird. For Gwen, it was kind of this very powerful, like, yes, I have several diagnoses that have to do with anxiety and a lot of sensory issues. But you know what? I've still achieved all these things. And it was like a celebration of she was able to recognize she had a lot of barriers in her way, and she found her way either over them, through them, around them. Sometimes it felt like we were digging under them. But at a certain point in her life, and this happened multiple times, she was really able to be like, yes, like part of who I am is because of my anxiety and because I have had to do all this extra work. Again, because she's an artist and a writer, I have also seen her in her self advocacy work and her work with others, make art about her experiences with anxiety and sensory processing issues and kind of celebrating it through her art and her writing. So don't be surprised if somewhere along the way, your child may kind of hit a spot where it's a big part of who they are, but it's a cherished part and it's an honored part. And I have to tell you, both from my clinical experience with families, but also as a mom myself, sometimes for us parenting adults, when they hit that celebration piece, it's a struggle because for us, we all go through that wishing that life was going to be easier for our kids. Like we've all been there, no matter what your role is in that cherished young person's life, we've all had that point where you look and you think, gosh, their life's going to be hard because of X. And if I could take it away, I would, right? Because we love them. Not that we feel that way all the time, but I think we've probably all been there and done that. So just be mindful, like if your child hits a celebratory phase, if you will, at the same time you're in the, oh, I wish their life would be easier phase, as a parent child relationship, that can be a bit of a struggle if those two things happen at the same time. So, just from a family perspective, I wanted to make you aware of that. Another thing we learned along the way is we want to always look to our kids for the answer. Children's behavior, just like adult behavior, is a form of communication and a message. So a lot of times when I'm working like in a classroom trying to help the educator figure whatever's going on, or in someone's home with them or meeting with the family, what I'm listening for is what is that adult telling me about the child's behavior, or what do I see as an observer, what is the kid trying to tell us? Because a lot of times behaviors have to do with an unmet need or a support they need. Like, for instance, you may get call from an educator at some point that says, your kid just can't be quiet, or your kid's always moving around or staring off into space. Or in Gwen's case, it was in kindergarten. Elizabeth, Gwen spent most of the day again under her desk. Right now, I could have gone in there or given Gwen a stern talking to, or we could have had a teacher that tried to drag her out from under the desk. But instead, what we did is we put our heads together and we thought, what might that behavior be about? Right. And so we thought about that perspective of being under a desk. And the first thing, we all noticed was that's a really enclosed space and it's darker than the rest of the classroom. So the mom in me was like, oh, maybe where she's sitting is too bright, right? Sensory wise. And the teacher was able to say, oh, or maybe let me look when she's doing that, because maybe it's when the other kids are, being rowdy. And so she's either feeling kind of too overstimulated auditorily, or maybe that's triggering anxiety for her because it was kind of early in the year initially. So, what that told us, though, was Gwen was giving herself a sensory break. Right. So the trick is when you see your children kind of displaying behaviors that initially might seem a bit challenging, think about, what is that behavior telling me? Like, is there an unmet need here? That the behavior is kind of taken care of for them. And if so, is that something we can just do? Or is it showing us an accommodation that they might need? Right. Back in my day, when I was growing up, there was no such thing as weighted blankets. Right. But those of us that needed them piled on the heavy blankets, right? Or we piled the blankets and then all of our stuffed animals on top of ourselves, or we burrowed under the pillow. Or I had one friend that would try and sleep in between the mattress and the box spring, right? As an adult now, you better believe she has a weighted blanket and it's pretty heavy, right? So a lot of times the behaviors that we might see as grown-ups as challenging is really the kid kind of showing us, if we learn how to look with slightly different eyes, what it is that they need, right? The other thing that's very common, especially for those of you that are parenting children who are, say, 7-year-olds on down, a lot of times young kiddos who are displaying challenging behaviors, what they're really saying is, I don't know how to do what you're asking me to do. Right. So it's that they're lacking the skill that they need. So that's also a support that we can provide as well. So it might be an accommodation of the environment, the physical environment. It might be accommodation of an emotional environment, kind of reducing a trigger perhaps, or helping our children learn better how to respond to something that triggers them. But it can also be them kind of saying, hello, I don't know how to do X, right? So I need you to teach me. And I will tell those of you whose kiddos are maybe just entering the school system, one of the things that I hear a lot from educators is they're not always, unless they're in special education, they don't get a whole lot of training on how do I teach social emotional skills, right? So in Illinois, we are starting to see the State Board of Education and other groups kind of recommending, hey, let's put some research-based social emotional curriculum in place, especially in, pre-K up to second or third grade. You may notice your child's school starting to do that. And that's because we're recognizing, on one hand, children need those supports, but on the flip side, even the educators may not have had training in how to do it. But we're lucky because there are a lot of really fine curriculum available, or exercises available for both families and educators. So that's something that's been nice, that's changed over time as those things have become developed. But I would suggest that always take that message or framework of, what is my child's behavior telling me? What are they trying to communicate? Because a lot of times, whatever the acting out or acting in behavior is showing us the support they need. If we adults can just figure out kind of how to decode the message, number one, and then how to translate it into an accommodation or a support that works for the child, but also works for the adult, or the environment, right? A lot of the work I do with schools is trying to figure out, okay, we know what this kiddo needs to succeed and to feel safer and more included in this classroom, but maybe the way they're displaying it right now is getting them in trouble, or it's not appropriate for the school setting. So that's part of my job, is to kind of try and help people think through, if the kid needs this, but this is the rule, where can we bend? Where can we accommodate? But also making sure that what the kid is telling us is getting represented in whatever the solution is. So one of the things is you start to kind of help your child advocate or advocate for your children if you need to with behaviors, like I had to as a mom. Always think about that Venn diagram that you may have learned in high school English class or math class along the way. So it's two circles. And what we're looking for is that sweet spot where they overlap. So this is the kid saying, I need this. And this is the adult saying, I need you to behave, quote, appropriately. And what we're looking for is that middle where the child's behavior is functional for the setting that they're in, but also works for the kid, right? And we all know sometimes our kids let their hair down at home, right? And they act very different at school. And that's okay. And it's fairly common. Sometimes it's, I'm really, quote, well behaved at school, and then I get home and I'm kind of off the chart, if you will. Um, and we want to be careful, if you're here as an educator, not to judge and think, oh, that parent doesn't set limits. They behave for me at school because I have all this structure, and that parent just lets them go willy-nilly. It can be the case that that kid's working really hard to be in your structured environment, and when they get home, they're just exhausted and they don't have anything left to stay that structured. So the family's kind of getting the dump. Or it can also be child doesn't feel so safe at school, so they're very structured and kind of do their best to stay in those lines all day, if you will. And then when they get home, or like in my case, to the counselor's office, kind of all hell breaks loose, or they go take a nap, or they do whatever that seems a little more dysregulated, because they're like, oh, I'm safe here, so I can just be me. So again, we always want to think about kids' behavior as a form of communication, and kind of what can we figure out as adults in order to help them better, because behavior is always going to have a message of some way, shape, or form, right? Now, as your kids age, when they're young, I think personally and professionally, it's really important to teach kids ways to support themselves and to provide those accommodations that they need. Because what you'll see as they age is that will help them be more conscious of themselves. Like, what is it that I need to feel comfortable in this environment? But it also teaches them kind of, how do I advocate for this, or how do I just take care of it myself? And so when I was preparing this originally, I had a long talk with Gwen about, what do you think from your perspective would be important to share in terms of components of our journey? And that was one of the things she mentioned was most important to her growing up, is that we always made sure to kind of look at what she was doing behaviorally and think to ourselves what supports need to be in place and advocate for them. So I have a picture here of a weighted vest, because many kids who have anxiety or sensory issues going on, or they might be on the spectrum, a whole variety of children benefit from kind of those weighted vests or that deep pressure. And Gwen was definitely one of them. And so, but what we noticed over time as she aged is she didn't like any of the weighted clothes as much anymore, and gradually shifted to taking care of things herself. And what that looks like for Gwen, and this is still true of her, she tends to wear things like a heavy sweatshirt or a jacket. She always wears her hair very long because she uses the weight of it. If any of you have ever had long hair and then gone to short, you know what I mean. There's a weight to having long hair. When she was in early elementary, she also figured out if I need a sensory break, but I can't really take one, I can use my hair and kind of hide behind it while I'm working and kind of create a sensory break, if you will, by kind of covering up my face with it and using it almost as a tool. So today, if she were to walk in from the other room, you'd see she probably has a sweatshirt on, even though it's a little roasty toasty down in my part of Illinois today, and she still wears her hair very long. As her mom, I got good at decoding kind of how stressful she was feeling about a situation because she reached a point in her life, and this happened probably around junior high, I would say, where on the daily, maybe she'd wear just a jacket. But if it was something good that she thought was going to be very anxiety provoking, she knows she feels better with heavier pressure. So she would shift over to a really heavy sweatshirt, for instance. And so I would use again her behavior as a message just to kind of pay attention and think, okay, this is how she's doing today. Like there's something going on where she's feeling like she needs that deep pressure. She knew that deep pressure was helpful to us or to her. Just from trying different things as she aged. She learned what worked for her. There was a point too in high school where she got really interested into wearing those heavy combat boots. And she also had this beautiful chainmail bracelet. The one time I tried it on, I mean, I felt like my wrist was going to hit the table. It was really heavy feeling to me, but she absolutely loved that bracelet because high school was very stressful for her initially. But I did notice by the time we got to junior year of high school, she wore that bracelet much less, and she hardly wears it at all now. So again, things will change over time, and we need to remember what our children need for supports in this moment may be different tomorrow, but it definitely will be different a few years from now. And so we want to just kind of keep an eye on things and recognize that that's a process and it's a journey that we're on with our kids, right? But one thing, like I said, Gwen wanted me to be sure to share with you that was important for her was that we kind of taught her early on, like, hey, these things seem to help you feel better. That's totally fine. Here's some other ways we might do that, right? And she knew she had our support along with our love, and she could then try different things for herself. And now, as an adult, she's in her early 20s now and graduated from college recently. And what I've observed is as an adult, she takes care of that on her own. As her mom, I can still gauge how she's doing by looking at what clothes she chooses in terms of the level of weight for them. So it's almost like originally when we're parenting our kids, we're doing a lot of management, if you will, for them. But as they age, we want to, as much as they can, give them those supports so that they can figure out what works best for them and build from there. And then if cognitively able and interested in terms of personality wise, it's a good idea then to continue that model because that's one way of helping our kids learn to advocate for themselves. Um, that said, here is a picture of Gwen, I think sophomore year of college. And you'll notice in that bigger picture, she's carrying a gray cat carrier tucked under her arm. One of the things that works beautifully for Gwen in terms of helping her manage anxiety is being around her cats. And her college has just a general, like many colleges do, no pet policy, right? So we started out freshman year without our beloved Viva with us. And her freshman year was the beginning of COVID. So, everything was, she was at her school, but everybody had to stay in their rooms and kind of learn online. I will say initially she was like, woohoo, mom, I don't have to go to any of this foolishness of, orientation activities and get to know you stuff. Cause for a kid like Gwen, like that's bleh, she doesn't want to do it. But what we noticed is the required isolation in terms of the rules and the regs, although initially it made it easier for her because she didn't have to do all the get to know you things, it also became a barrier because there was no way for her to kind of reach out and say, oh, I'm feeling really isolated, and that can be anxiety producing for me. So one of the things she eventually said to me was, it would really help to have my pet. And I'm very proud to say that Gwen was able to do all of her own research, kind of having grown up in a household that advocated initially for her and then with her. She then advocated for herself. So she looked at the policies, she looked at the emotional support laws, she figured out, like, I don't need a anxiety dog per se, like I'm not having seizures, I'm not having anything where I need a trained service animal, but I do have a diagnosis, and I do know for myself that my anxiety is better managed when I have my Viva cat with me. And so she approached her physician on her own, talked it through, explained what kind of letters she would need. Her physician wrote the letter. She worked with her college's disabilities office to get that processed. And you will notice that by mid first semester of her freshman year, I took Viva to live with her. And then sophomore year, Viva moved in with her at the beginning of the year. And so Viva graduated college as well and spent all four years there with Gwen. And I will say, as a mom, I do think that made a big difference, having her pet with her. So I will tell you, if you think that an emotional support animal would be helpful to your child as they're kind of moving on, moving up, moving out, and you ever need kind of some feedback on how to get that done, my Gwen would be happy to walk your kiddo or you through that process, because that's one thing that she feels really strongly about advocating, and helping other people kind of think through, how do I work with my school or my apartment on that. Right now, she is looking into getting apartments. And so I've had fun watching, as her mom, again, her kind of saying, I have a cat, I know what the laws are. Here's all of my paperwork for this. And just kind of taking care of it on her own, right? So very rarely does she need to talk through anything with me. And I've had the pleasure of watching her kind of develop those skills as she aged. I think, though, a lot of those skills came from us always working together, and then me gradually kind of backing off and saying, okay, I think Gwen has this, so I'm going to have less of a role. And for some parents, that's hard to do, because we have this concept of, we have to kind of manage for our kids all the time. And so that's something to kind of be mindful as your child ages and develops new skills. We parents may get in the way a little bit of our kids' development if we don't kind of start backing off a little bit. And I'm not saying, like, go away, close the door, and never help them again by any means. Like, it's a slow process, but you really want to kind of see, what can my kiddo do on their own now? And it's a very bittersweet experience as a parent. If you haven't been there yet, I'll just give you a little heads up, because on one hand, we're super proud of where our kids are, whatever the accomplishment is. But at the same time, it's a little bit like, oh, they don't need me right there. Right. And so, depending on kind of what your role has been, with your kiddo along their way and along their growing up years, that can be a moment where it can be a little hard. I can also say it's totally typical if it also feels a little scary when you get to that place. Like, can my kid really do this? Right. And so, one of the things towards the end I'm going to talk about is kind of that sense of connection, and how important it is to have other people in our lives whose children also have similar disabilities to what our kids have. So we can kind of have that shared experience of, I feel scared about this right now, like in my heart. My head knows it's good, but it's still scary. scary. And is that okay? And to have someone else sit across from you and say, oh my goodness, been there, done that, it makes us feel so much better. So that's why I'm going to end with that connection piece. Another thing we learned along the way is some years are better than others. And Gwen used to say, some days I thrive and some days I'm just surviving, right? Um, and so when we were in kindergarten, and this is her real name, we were very blessed to have Linda Poppy as Gwen's teacher. That was the year that Gwen spent a big chunk of it initially under her desk. Mrs. Poppy, if she had misunderstood Gwen's behavior, she might have tried to drag her out of there. She might have seen her as the most defiant kid on the planet. Instead, when I went in as a panicky mom, like, oh my gosh, what do you mean Gwen is under her desk? Like, what can we do? Mrs. Poppy looked at me and she said, Elizabeth, don't worry. My son has anxiety too. I know sometimes Gwen needs a break. So here's what Gwen and I have worked out. And she's like, if Gwen needs to pop under there, that's fine. And I said, but what about her work? And she said, well, if Gwen happens to be under, what I do is I just lower my hand when I'm handing out their papers and I drop it off. And when Gwen gets it done, she slides it out to me. Right now, initially, as a parent, I was like, but that's not okay. Like, you can't go to school like that. And here's what I learned. Yes, you can. Right. In today's world, with all the inclusion we're doing, a lot of what's happening is kids and adults are learning, like, we all like to do things differently sometimes. And we're discovering there's a lot of things where the world is going to continue to function A-OK and perhaps even better when we allow people to kind of have the seat they need or work in the way they do, or stand up while they're doing something, or move around while they're doing something, or use a communication board versus sign language, whatever. So one of the things as you're doing and going along in your parenting journey is to just reassure yourself it really is okay to do accommodations. Some of us have kids where they're going to need accommodations for the long haul, maybe even forever. Some of you have kids where we just need them for a little while, right? However that shakes out is going to be okay. Right. One of my big concerns, because I'm fairly extroverted as a person, Gwen is introverted and then she has anxiety on top of it. So I was like, oh gosh, what is she going to do career wise? And she's like, Mom, I want to write. I want to make art. I can do editing online and earn plenty of money and be fine and just interact with people when I feel like it. Guess what? That's happened for her. Right. So it really, I promise you, it will come out okay in the end. We did, however, run into some situations that made it feel like it might not be okay. Now, this name has been changed to protect the not so innocent. But when Gwen hit fifth grade, we had a teacher that we sarcastically call Fabulous, name change, Foster. Um, and that was the first year where I had to go in and do a 504 for Gwen, because my usual thing was I would go in ahead of the school year, kind of fill them in on Gwen's anxiety and sensory and share what it might look like in the classroom and kind of what had worked in the past, and let them know we were open to hearing however it was going and working together. I think that's a really good way of approaching educators. Um, and everyone along the way was like, okay. And they would fill me in and they might say, Gwen's really struggling socially because she has this face that she makes sometimes when she's overwhelmed. So let's work on that together. We got all the way to fifth grade without needing anything formal, because Gwen's anxiety does not impact her learning enough where we would need an IEP, right? But when we got to fifth grade, by then Gwen was coming with me early in the school year. So we would go before school started, we'd check out the classroom, because if your child has any kind of anxiety, it's always good to increase the amount of information and knowledge they feel like they have. That's also good for us parents of children whose needs might be different or who have disabilities. Fifth grade was the first time we walked in. Gwen was explaining and I was explaining. She might, wear her sweatshirt quite often, especially at the beginning of the year, even though it was hot. And he looked at us and was like, not in my classroom. I'm not going to have a kid, overheating in here. I'm not going to worry about that. You can leave it in your locker. And he was very, very firm about that. So that was the first year where all of the things I usually did as a parent did not work with an educator. And so I could have just said, oh, crud, we're going to have a really bad year here. Instead, what I did was I went to the principal. I tried not to come in like guns a-blazing, but I did say, I think we're going to have a problem. The way I know we might fix it is to do a 504, because then you have a legal document that needs to be followed. Luckily, we have a really supportive principal, and that's what we did. And when I say luckily, the reason I'm saying that is when Fabulous Foster would try not to follow the 504, Gwen self-advocated and would let me know or let her principal know. And then the principal would go down and kind of take care of business, if you will, and kind of keep him on track. So that's why it's important to have a kid that self-advocates. Now, Gwen is also of the nature where if you mistreat other people who are underdogs in some way, or kind of who are different in some way, or her, she really doesn't like it. So in her 5th grade year, as worried as I was as her mom, that was her biggest growth year in terms of self-advocating and sticking up for not only herself, but really championing other kids. And by that, I mean, she started kind of looking out for other kids. If she saw Fabulous Foster kind of making a snide comment or not giving kids the help that they needed, she would kind of go alongside and provide that for them, right? When he began to ignore the class and kind of use his cell phone a whole lot, somebody's kid in the classroom may have started taking notes on when that was happening and kind of sliding them to the principal anonymously. I don't know which kid did that, but somebody's kid did that. So he had to change his behavior and become more interactive. So again, be mindful as your kid ages, you're going to see changes in the level of willingness they have to self-advocate. But one way, if that's important to you, as it was to me, is you model that advocating for them and then with them as they're growing and changing. But do recognize some teachers really will work with you, and others it may be a struggle. I think that particular teacher just had something about maybe inclusion or what have you. The other thing you may run into, one of the things that we need to have inclusion be successful is to have good training and good understanding for teachers. So it is a real gift to start the beginning of the year sharing, these are the things that work with my child. Here are some of their characteristics and what they've looked like in the past in other people's classrooms or programs, right? So you're setting up the let's work on this together, right? You're also, though, setting up, I see that you have expertise as an educator, but you also need to see that I have expertise as the parent of this child, or the parenting adult, or the loving grown-up that goes with this child, right? So we want to set up kind of that equal playing field. That can be really, really important, right? Another thing that we learned along the way is that sometimes in our journey as parenting adults, there's going to be some grief along the way. And one of the things that sometimes gets lost and not recognized is when we have a kiddo who, for whatever reason, can't do what everybody else does. So for my girls, that was going to Disney World, right? I live in a part of Illinois where everybody saves for years and you take a big trip to Disney while your kids still like it, like when they're in the princess phase or what have you. My girls, I knew that would be an absolute flop. It's going to be too crowded, too noisy, too whatever, right? And so I very early on recognized we are not going to make that Disney trip. even with thinking about accommodations and things, I knew that it wasn't going to work for us, right? I was surprised about how much grief I felt. Professionally, I understood why I felt grief. But even as a parent, I was just like, wow, that's kind of ouchy. Because it's kind of like we have this vision, at least in my part of Illinois, like that's what you do as a family at some point. So, one of the things that's important is to keep tabs too, not only of doing what's right for your family and being brave and advocating about that, even if it's stuff that everybody else does, in quotes, but also recognize when we hit those points in our lives, you may feel some grief or loss because things aren't, you're not having the life that you thought you might, right? Or your family's not doing some of the things that you thought you might. And if you have that grief, please recognize that is natural and typical. It is not that there's anything wrong with you. Okay. And again, that's a good place to find some connection with others. The other piece to keep in mind is that you're going to run into people that are not always good to connect with. And sometimes, honestly, and very painfully, that person's going to be in your own family, right? In my case, it was my mom who really struggled to understand Gwen's sensory issues in particular, right? And so a lot of times I would get told, like, she needs a spanking, she needs a talking to. Why, Elizabeth, are you letting her act like that? It's all an act, like she's pulling one over on all of you. Or someone would say she just needs to buck up and deal with it, right? These folks have no concept of my kiddo's experience, and I recognize that very early on. What was interesting, though, and very healing for my relationship with my mom and Gwen's relationship with her grandma, was once my mom retired, she happened to volunteer at Gwen's school. And we have a family in our community that has several sons. All of them are somewhere on the spectrum. And as they have had more kids, it seems to get more severe with each child. My mom was the kind of AR, so the accelerated reading program where kids kind of read on their own and answer questions for points. She volunteered and helped with that. So she came home one day and said to me, I saw a miracle today, Elizabeth, at school. And I said, well, what did you see? And one of the boys had really, whatever, something had happened that had really triggered him and set him off. And so they had taken one of the kind of sensory pods, the stretchy where you put the child inside so they're kind of enclosed and they can stretch it all out and it's got some resistance to it. And they had allowed him to use that and he calmed right down. And so my mom was just like, it was like magic. Like he was all upset and all over the floor and screaming. And then they gave him this fabric thing, and then he was fine. And I'm sitting there and I just looked at her and I said, you realize Gwen has one of those too, right? And I helped her recall a time when Gwen had gotten it and used it at one of the times she had triggered her. But so it was interesting. I'm sharing that just to say sometimes in our families, it's like, it's all too close, and it takes someone who we're struggling with to see it outside of the family before they can go, okay, now I get it, right? And some of that is, my mom's own grief about like, oh, Gwen's life is going to be harder because of this. But my mom is coming from that perspective of, so you just march, you march through it and you push somebody and you can make it different that way. Like she doesn't have that understanding. So for her, tutoring and seeing another child using that same accommodation tool was very helpful for her, right? So be careful who you're around, but also don't give up is the message there. The other thing you can do that's super healing is gather those family and friends who do get it close to you and make sure you're making connections with them a lot. You can join Facebook groups and communities, come to our moms retreats that we offer through StarNet and dad's events. But the main thing is to always remember that you are not alone in this journey, even though sometimes it's going to feel like that. And then the last thing in terms of our journey is that remember that you're your child's hope holder, right? So you are the one, sometimes it's going to be the encourager and kind of thinking about their future and what they are capable of doing, right? So here's my Gwen enjoying a lovely day in the woods, and you'll notice she's got her long hair and her sweatshirt on, and we have come an awfully, awfully long way. All right. So since we are not altogether, we'll skip this, but what I want you to do is maybe think of this as some homework. So the next time you're talking with a fellow parent, share something positive that you have learned along the way. Okay, that worked for your family. Or actually, I think Megan said we can save the chat. So, how about take a minute, if you can find your chat box, and add something in there that you've learned along your parenting journey that you think might be helpful to someone else, like a little tip, if you will. Right. I will move us forward, but feel free to keep adding things in the chat, and then maybe we can share that out with everyone. All right. So here are some ideas. I said at the beginning that having that sense of calm can be really, really important for all of our mental health. So, first things first, adults must take care of themselves, right? And if you've flown on an airplane, you know they kind of hammer that in about making sure to put your oxygen mask on first, because we have to be able to be upright and helpful to our kids. And so that means we need to think of ways that work for us to keep our calm in place. So, one of the things that I think about a lot is we all hold, right? We're holding our children's hopes and dreams, we're holding our sadness, we're holding our experience. And so, I always remind myself to be a pitcher and not a vase, meaning that pitchers, vases are made only to hold. Pitchers can hold, but they can also pour out. So, one of the things that I would like to encourage you to do is think about what works for you to reduce your stress, right? To get that feeling out. And one of the things that I know as a clinician that I find not everyone knows, so I wanted to share with you, is we know research wise from the time we're very young, we each have a place in our body where kind of those intense emotions like anger and stress come out. Some of us are mouth people, right? So for you, if you're a mouth person, singing or talking to someone can be really helpful. Some of us are hand people, right? So you might, when you were younger, have been the kind of person to like hit your sister or pinch your brother or tear up your homework, right? When you were upset, you benefit most from using your hands. So something like journaling, crafting, dribbling a basketball, anything that processes with hands can be really, really helpful. The last place anger and stress might pop out on our body is some of us are feet people. So if you think about it, when you were little, you might have kicked other people or stomped out of the room, thrown a temper tantrum. A lot of times feet people grow up to be the ones that go for a run or a walk when they're upset, or they do something athletic, or they like to dance, or they like to move in some way, or as Taylor Swift says, shake it off. The key is to think about where is your expressive point, and we can look back to childhood a lot of times and look what did you get in trouble for when you were expressing anger, and make sure as an adult you are providing yourself some activities that match your own expressive point instead of just talking if you're not a mouth person, right? Our society is kind of prone to talking, and we want to make sure that if you're a hand or a foot person, you're giving yourself some opportunity, and your kids, because they have expression points too, to express in a way that works best for them. We also know when we get really upset, we tend to shift from our thinking brain, which is up here, in our frontal lobes, our neocortex, back to our limbic system, which is kind of above your ears, or if you get really stressed out, all the way to your hindbrain, where survival mode. So one of the things that research tells us we can do is re-engage our thinking brain by doing some cognitive tasks. Now, you may have been told somewhere in your life to count to 10. If you've done that, you know that's not very calming, and that's because it's too easy for most of us. So find an intellectual task, and by that I mean something that makes you think about things. For me, it's saying the ABCs backwards. I have a friend that counts by 7, right? Do an activity like that where you can do it, but you need to think about it a little bit. And that will help you pull back up into thinking brain when you're kind of sliding back into emotional brain. That can be a really good strategy to use, for instance, during an IEP meeting. If you feel yourself starting to get a little bit on the emotional side and you want to, kind of get that thinking back engaged. Another one that we mental health consultants use all the time is what they call the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. So for that, it uses the sensory system. And the reason it's good is when we become stressed, we tend to kind of disconnect from the world around us and go in our heads. So what we do here, and you can do this with me, we're going to focus on 5 things that we can see. So look around, identify 5 things that you see, and kind of label them in your head. When you have that done, find 4 things that you can touch and actually reach out and touch them from wherever you're sitting or standing or laying, and label them in your mind. Then you want to do 3 things that you can hear right now and label those. 2 things that you can smell and label that. And then the last one is 1 thing that you can taste or you remember tasting recently, and label that. The reason that can be helpful is, again, it pulls us out of that anxiety thinking and gets us back in that present moment. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with mindfulness. So if you're not, here's a little bit of homework. And these strategies are all in your handouts, by the way. One of the easiest strategies for practicing mindfulness is just to do what we call noting practice. So we can do this for a minute or so together. So sit comfortably wherever you are. Take a nice deep breath in your nose and out your mouth. And just pay attention to how you're breathing. So in and out. And notice any thoughts you're having or physical sensations you're having, but rather than thinking about them, let them kind of float on past. Focus on your breathing and just let things kind of float on past. The reason I wanted to give you a very brief experience of that is that we know just 5 minutes a day of that noting practice, research says within a month or so, allows us all to feel much, much calmer. So that can be a really good strategy to use. And it's a simple one that you can do wherever. We also, and I put kids on here because these are strategies especially that work well, even if your kiddos are young. And a lot of people with different needs or atypical development really benefit from what we call heavy work. So you'll have a handout in your handouts for that as well. But just some different strategies. So the little girl's doing a self-hug. If you want to try that, the trick is to crisscross your arms and kind of grab your upper arms and give yourself a squeeze, see what pressure works well, and then also push down towards your chest. Can be really, really helpful. I also gave you a visual that you can use. And again, it's in your handouts for progressive muscle relaxation. And you also have in your handouts kind of how we define heavy work, because a lot of times someone will recommend that for a child. And my experience has been parenting adults don't always know what that is. So I gave you a list of different activities. If someone should ever say your child or adolescent might benefit from heavy work, you'll have those activities so you know what that might mean. But it's a way of kind of providing that stronger feedback to the muscular and joint system. And for some people, that's very, very calming. I also wanted to share with you a couple breathing strategies that work well for adults, but also for kids. So when I'm working with kids, a lot of times I start with this one first. So if you're able, you take your pointer finger and first we're going to smell it. So it's going to be a flower. So we'll breathe in our nose and then drop your finger. Now it's a birthday candle and just blow out your candle. Flower to candle is a nice way of teaching kiddos. We go in our nose and out our mouths when we're doing breathing. You can also use your hand. We have a lot of companies that are making like those breathing boards now where you can trace with your finger. Those are fabulous. But if you don't have one handy, I don't want you to be out of luck. So this is how you do it with your hand. So you extend your hand, you start down here by your thumb, and basically each time we go up a finger, we are going to breathe in, and you get to the top and you hold it, and then out. So just trace your hand, breathe in your nose, get to the top, do a little hold, and then out your mouth. The nice thing about using our hands is it also gives us a little bit of sensory input. And those of you that like deep pressure, you might push a little harder with the finger that's tracing your hand. It also reminds us to do 5, because for a lot of us, that 5 breaths is what our brain needs to make a difference. I also wanted to share with you, this strategy is specific for folks who might be experiencing anxiety itself. And it's called the 4Bs times 3. And you'll notice this combines breath and kind of some brain and deep pressure work. So the first thing you do is you take your 2 hands, palms together, and push as hard as you can while counting to 5. If you want to do this with me so you can experience it, I'm going to drop our hands to our sides and let them relax. Bring them back up and push again for a count of 5. Drop and relax. And each of these things, it's the 4Bs times 3, because we're going to repeat each thing 3 times. So our third time. Okay. And then the next one, we're going to take a deep breath. And again, we'll repeat this 3 times. In our nose, out our mouth, and we're going to raise our arms over our head while you're going in. And then when you breathe out, come back down. If you want to add a little bit of a focus to this, when you get up to the top, you can cross your hands at your wrist. Crossing that midline is really calming to most of us, and it also helps focus. So it's good for kids who have any kind of anxiety going on to cross midline, but it's also really nice if your kiddo has something like ADHD, especially the inattentive type or the combined type can be really helpful. For the brain part, we put our right hand on top of our heads, left hand goes on top, and we're just going to push down as hard as we can, or as hard as feels good to us. And again, this is that deep pressure. And then we're going to let go. And we're going to repeat, and you'll notice I've got my hands crossed up top. So this is another one that gets us that a bit of a midline cross, which again is good for focusing. If your kiddo has any problems focusing at school, doing a midline cross periodically throughout the day can be helpful. And then the last one is that hug that we've already practiced. So just think about pressure and pushing down, and then release, and we're going to do 2 more. The research says For people that have anxiety, if you want to do this strategy, it's important to do them in this order. Neurology says that's very calming to our systems and our body. So again, that is in your handout. The reason there's some extra arrows at the end is sometimes we need to repeat until we can feel ourselves calming down. Now, a lot of us experience worry or kind of those anxious thoughts. So I also wanted to share this sequence that can be really, really helpful, both to kids, adolescents, and to adults, or all three of us. So first, we're going to close our eyes. That allows us to disconnect, at least via one sense. Then take some nice relaxation breaths in our nose and out our mouths. And then we're going to reconnect with the physical environment. Keep your eyes closed, but identify 3 sounds that you can hear. And again, label them like we did in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 strategy. And then add a cognition, a self-assurance. So say to yourself, it will be okay, or I will be okay. That's part of that self-compassion. And then take a nice deep breath in your nose, out your mouth, and then open your eyes when you're ready. That strategy, if you have a kid who's a worrier, or if you yourself are a worrier, that's a really good strategy to use. Even if you're like walking yourself into some kind of meeting. The other thing I just wanted to remind everyone is it is perfectly okay to shut off stuff that's triggering you. For instance, the news or a TV show or a video game or the radio, or walk away from a conversation if you need to. I think we can give ourselves better permission to take some breaks. I also wanted to share this one with you. You have the instructions in your handout packet, but the best way I think to learn this one, if you know this man, is Dr. Andrew Weil, and he is an integrative. He's an MD, but he does integrative medicine. And so the 478 strategy is one that will put you in an altered state of consciousness. So I don't want to do it with you right now in case anyone has to drive anywhere, since we're going to be done in about 15 minutes or so. But this is a great one if you or your kid experiences anything like panic attacks, or it also works beautifully as part of a bedtime routine, because it kind of alters our state of consciousness by doing some really kind of very controlled breathing that's also very forceful. So what I would encourage you to do, and it's got the link or the connector in your handouts, is hop on Andrew Weil's website or just Google 478 breathing, and it will show you the that strategy. All right. Oh, the other strategy, and this is the one the Navy SEALs use. So this one we'll do together. So Navy SEALs use this. This is called box breathing, and it works very nicely. And again, this is one you can teach your kiddos, but it's also good for we adults. And so I'm going to play 2 cycles of it for us, but this is also in your handouts. Go ahead and slowly resume breathing normally, whatever feels comfortable to you. With both 4-7-3 and box breathing, it's about kind of maintaining um, control over our breathing. Now, I also wanted to make sure to share some things about self compassion because I think as parents of children who have disabilities or other forms of special needs, sometimes we need to be kinder and gentle to ourselves. So this is a strategy, again, it's in your handouts, to use when you are suffering or when you're going through a hard time. So I would like you to practice this with me if you're someplace where you feel comfortable doing that. So again, we're going to cross over our chest and whatever pressure is comfortable to you. So you put both hands over your heart and just give yourself a sec to feel the warmth there. And then take some nice deep breaths in and out. And then what you do, if you want to read along with me there, or you can say silently. I personally find saying it aloud is more powerful, but in a warm and loving tone, same as we would speak to our kiddos. This is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I be kind to myself in this moment. And may I give myself the compassion that I need, right? That's a strategy that I personally have posted a couple places in my house because we all have rough days. And it's very comforting. If you start practicing that strategy, you will find that you get better at giving yourself the compassion that you need, which then helps us be able to be better parenting adults when we can treat ourselves with compassion. So, if you would take just a minute and put in the chat box your favorite way to de stress, maybe you're going to add something that other people haven't thought about. Um, or you'll have something that doesn't take very long because a lot of us that have kids that have special needs don't have a lot of extra time on our hands. And then while you all are working on that, I just wanted in closing to share a few more thoughts on kind of family connection and why connection can be so important for us as parenting adults, but also within our families in terms of our kiddos' development. So, again, some things that I know as an educator, but also that Gwen and I and our family learned along the way. One of the things we know, especially those of you that are parenting kids who are maybe 8 years on down, is little ones really rely on us to help regulate and when they're feeling upset or stressed. So if you have a child who's got some sensory issues or who becomes emotionally dysregulated really easily, so they have some temper tantrums, they have high anxieties, one of the biggest gifts we can give as loving grown-ups, be us parenting adults or professionals, is when little people feel overwhelmed by their big emotions, share our calm instead of joining in their chaos. And by that, she simply meant we can keep our cool and not join in their stress. In our family, I have a little saying that snails are wise, right? So this is kind of a summary of what our family has learned works best for us in terms of connecting with each other. So the S is for slowing down. I don't know about you, but our family is super busy. So sometimes we just need to say, hold up, let's spend an evening at home doing something quiet together, right? Or just spend some time, a few minutes looking at the clouds before we pull out of the parking lot. N stands for noticing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So that's noticing one another is a wonderful way to honor each other. Acknowledging and accepting other people's perspectives and experiences might be different than your own. So we're going to notice, but also really be mindful of acknowledging and accepting. having an inquiring attitude, right? So I'm interested in knowing and understanding you better can be really helpful way, especially if when you hit those conflict points with your kiddos. And then in our household, the L is love and laughter go a long, long way to making things better. Just a little, word of caution. We know cell phones are very, very common. I have mine right here, helping me keep track of things. But we also know they cause separation when our family mealtime starts to look like this. So do think about putting those cell phones down sometimes so you can connect with one another as human beings. We also are seeing kind of that disconnection really impact kids that have already have some social skills issues or already have differences in the way they relate to other people can exacerbate the problem. So on one hand, technology is wonderful. On the other hand, do make sure that within your family time, you've got some non-technology time where you're just hanging out together, doing something that is fun for everyone. All right. So in the chat box, if you want to add something that is really working for your family as a way to connect, Megan can save those and make sure those ideas get shared out.
Go ahead and put that in the Q&A because it looks like some people are having trouble with the chat box, but we're capturing everything in the Q&A. So go ahead and use that.
Thank you, Megan. Then as we're wrapping up, the last concept I just want to end with, speaking both personally again as a parent, but also as a psychotherapist, I cannot stress enough how important connection to other people is, especially when we're having challenging experiences. And the way I think about it is connection is protection. We know that people who feel connected to others and that we have that safety net in our lives are much more resilient and they feel better. And it's a lovely way to take care of those moments when we are struggling as adults or connecting our kids to other kids or their siblings to other siblings who have a sibling with a disability. So making sure that we have someone safe to talk about the things that are challenging for us and help us process our reactions and thoughts and feelings can be really important. The caveat I want to give you, though, or the caution is make sure that that person is someone who's really going to listen to hear you rather than respond, which means they're only listening to kind of give you how to fix it, right? A lot of times we just want to be heard. And be careful to talk with folks who build you up rather than adding to your stress. So we know sometimes when we're in a group of people that are similar, everyone kind of does the dump of what's bothering them, right? And so a piece of that feels good, like, oh, you get it. But the other thing we've learned as psychologists is you kind of pick up everybody's stuff and take it with you. So that misery loves company can sometimes get in our way. So what I would say is if you or when you hit those places where you're kind of down in the pit and it's really a struggle, that's a time to reach out to someone who can really listen to you and who can be that positive, non-judgmental support rather than someone who's going to kind of join you in the misery of the situation. That's the faster way to feel better. To help you with that, and this is the handout that I think I forgot to send to Megan, so I'll get that to her as soon as we're done. I developed a handout that's called the Web of Connection, and it's based on the Native American legends of Grandmother Spider. And her whole role in Native American culture is to help people understand how connected we all are. And so your homework, if you would like to do it, is to put your name in the middle of the web And then closest to you would be the people that you could go to 24/7 for anything. And then on the outside, as you work your way out, in the outside ring are those professionals or websites or support groups that you've found. So maybe not anybody that's your 24/7 best bud or family member, but people or professionals that you know have something that can give to you. All right. So focus on creating some calm using some of those strategies that we talked about. Make those connections. And I do wish you well and hope that all of us have ways to really enjoy being together as a family. I thank you for your time this afternoon. I'm going to turn it back over to Megan. And do remember, if you need the professional development, to follow that link.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It was great to be able to hear it all the way and not be distracted as I was at the event. And it's just a wonderful presentation. I appreciate it. Just as a reminder, I know some people had chat issues, so I am going to tell you my email. It's mmuttii@fmptic.org. Or you can go to the website and email me through that. I realize that I can't put it in the chat for those of you who are having trouble. You're not going to be able to see it. So that's why I had to say it out loud, which I know is not ideal. If you had difficulty, let me know. If you weren't able to sign into the PD, I understand that the ROE has a different date and title on there. I think she thought that would update automatically and it didn't. So we're going to fix all of that with her. So don't worry about that. It looks like somebody has their hand up. Let me see who it is. Let's see. Lucia, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. Go ahead. It looks like you're going to need to unmute on your end, though.
Thank you very much. Great experience.
You're welcome. I'm glad that you had a good experience. Anybody else? Okay, with that, we will send the recording of the webinar. It takes a couple of days, but we'll get that out to you. You should have gotten handouts about an hour before the presentation. So if for some reason you did not get those, again, you can just email me and we'll get them to you. And it sounds like Elizabeth has a fourth handout, so we'll send that out to the group as well. And if you have anything that you need, keep in mind you are going to get that survey. It is super helpful to us. It only takes a minute to give us your feedback. But if you have questions or concerns or anything, please feel free to reach out. I want to look one last time at the question and answer just to make sure that I don't have any questions in here. Elizabeth, do you have time for one question? It looks like right here at the end. How do you handle roller coaster of emotions when schools refuse to acknowledge delay providing accommodations? Any thoughts on that?
Think if you know ahead of time, using any of those strategies, especially like box breathing, would be really handy in that situation. So you go in as calm as possible. I think also when we're faced with situations where we're already worried it might not work out the way it should, the other thing we can do is arm ourselves with information. So I would suggest you contact Megan's organization so you know things like, this is what the law says, this is what my rights are, this is what my children's rights are. Here are some ways that accommodations might look, or here are some ways to write IEPs. Attend those webinars and workshops where you can learn as much as possible about how all those school functions work. That can be really helpful to calm, because you're kind of leveling that playing field. But I do think in those situations, it's really important, like we were talking about, to find a way to pull yourself from that emotional brain up into thinking brain. And very often, like that breathing or that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 might be helpful in that situation as well.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Some of those practical exercises Elizabeth offered were kind of the most important takeaways that people mentioned in their surveys from her previous. And as I heard them again today, Elizabeth, I thought I can see why they're so powerful. So, thank you. And with that, I will let you all go for Friday afternoon. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Again, feel free to reach out by email if you have any issues with anything. We'll follow up with ROE9 on the PD concern. And from that, we'll just hope to see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.